There is a moment in some marriages when you finally hear what has always been said, not for the first time, but for the first time, clearly. Richard Calloway had sat through 1,000 small cuts dressed up as humor. He had laughed along, he had refilled his glass and smiled at the ceiling. But on the night of his wife's office party, surrounded by people he barely knew, something inside him went very quiet. And in that quiet, he understood everything. This is the story of Richard James Calloway and his wife, Diane Calloway. They had been married for 28 years, long enough for their habits to outlast their conversations, long enough for familiarity to feel like love, even when love had quietly stepped out the back door. On the surface, theirs was a stable life. A house in a good neighborhood, 2 grown children, dinner at 7, but underneath that stability ran something thin and unexamined. A current of quiet diminishment that Richard had learned to call marriage and Diane had learned to call personality. The story is not about a betrayal that happens in a single night. It is about the slow erosion of a man's sense of himself, and the single evening when the tide finally pulled back far enough for him to see what the water had been hiding all along. Richard Calloway had retired 18 months ago from 30 years in civil engineering. He was 61 years old, steady by nature, the kind of man who kept the same brand of coffee for 2 decades and felt no need to explain himself. Retirement had softened his edges in ways he hadn't expected. He cooked more. He read in the afternoons. He walked the dog, a slow, arthritic golden retriever named Bentley, along the same stretch of riverside path each morning, and he found a genuine peace in that routine that surprised him. Diane, on the other hand, had accelerated. She was 58 and in the peak years of her career as a regional director for a mid-sized pharmaceutical company. She traveled 3 weeks out of every month. She had a team of 12 people who deferred to her. She came home on Friday evenings with the particular energy of someone who had been important all week and was now expected to downshift into ordinary life. They were not unhappy exactly. That would have been too simple. They were parallel, moving in the same direction but along separate tracks, rarely intersecting unless something forced them to. Richard had noticed this, the way you notice a slow leak. Not with alarm, just with a low awareness that something needs attending to eventually. He would cook dinner and she would eat it while scrolling through emails. He would mention something he'd read, about infrastructure or history, or a documentary he'd watched, and she would make the soft sound of someone who is listening politely, but thinking about something else. He told himself this was just tiredness. She worked hard. She carried a great deal. He was not resentful. He was understanding. That was how he chose to frame it. Their neighbor, Gordon Whitfield, had become an unlikely companion during this period. Gordon was 64, recently widowed, a quiet man who had once been an architect and now spent his days restoring furniture in his garage. He and Richard had fallen into the easy friendship of 2 men who were more comfortable with silence than with small talk. They drank coffee on Tuesday mornings. They talked about practical things: wood grain, soil conditions, the broken storm drain at the end of the street. Diane found Gordon pleasant but slightly dull. She said this once, lightly, the way she said most things, with the brisk certainty of a woman who had assessed the room in under 60 seconds and moved on. Richard had not replied. He had simply poured himself more coffee and looked out the kitchen window. That evening, as he was setting the table for a dinner she would be 40 minutes late to, his phone buzzed with a reminder he had set for himself 3 weeks earlier. Dee's company event, Friday the 14th. Wear the gray blazer. He looked at the reminder for a long moment. He had almost forgotten. He confirmed he would attend, put the phone face down on the counter, and went back to the kitchen. The pasta was almost done. Bentley was asleep by the radiator. The house was quiet in the particular way that houses become quiet when one person has been alone in them for most of the day. It was an ordinary evening. He would remember it later as the last one that felt uncomplicated. The week before the party, Diane mentioned it twice. Once to remind him of the dress code, business smart, not business formal. There was a difference, and she said it in a tone that implied he might not know it. And once to mention that her colleague Priya would be bringing her husband, who was apparently very interesting, worked in renewable energy. Richard might like him. The way she said it had a faint note of reassurance in it, as if she were offering him the interesting husband as consolation for what might otherwise be a difficult evening. Richard listened. He said he was looking forward to it, and mostly he meant it. He was not a man who feared social situations. He was simply a man who had grown quieter in them over the years, not from shyness, but from a gradual conviction that what he had to say was rarely what the room wanted to hear. He noticed that Diane had not asked whether he was comfortable. She had not asked what he had been doing that week, or whether the Tuesday walk with Bentley had gone well, or whether the leak in the garage roof that he'd been monitoring had gotten worse after Wednesday's rain. These were not dramatic omissions. They were simply the texture of their days now, his life happening mostly in the margins of hers. On Thursday evening, the night before the party, he watched her prepare. She was at her dressing table with the particular focused energy she brought to things that mattered to her professionally. She had laid out 3 earring options. She was speaking quietly to herself as she reviewed some notes on her phone. Names, probably. Roles. A few key things to remember about who was who. He sat on the edge of the bed and watched her, and there was something in that moment, something he couldn't quite name then, that felt like grief. Not the sharp kind, the low, atmospheric kind that settles into a room the way cold does, through the walls, without announcement. He thought about when they had met. She had been 30, brilliant and restless and easily bored, and he had found that restlessness electrifying. He had wanted to be the person who kept her interested. For years, he believed he had been. He was no longer certain when that had changed. "You look tired," she said, glancing at him in the mirror. "I'm fine," he said. "Don't be quiet all night tomorrow," she said. It was not unkind exactly, it was practical. A note for the occasion. He nodded. "I won't be." She went back to her earrings. He went to the bathroom and stood at the sink and looked at himself for longer than usual. 61 years old, gray at the temples, a face that had always been more trustworthy than handsome, which he had made peace with long ago. He turned off the light and went to bed. Neither of them said good night. They had stopped somewhere in the last few years without either of them deciding to. The party was held at a hotel conference center 40 minutes outside the city. It was the kind of room that had been made warm through effort. Good lighting, round tables with white linens, a small stage at the front where someone had arranged a tasteful floral display. The company's logo glowed on a screen behind the podium. Richard wore the gray blazer. He shook hands with people whose names he immediately forgot. He found Priya's husband, whose name was Owen, and they did in fact talk about carbon capture, about a bridge in Edinburgh that Richard had always admired, about the particular loneliness of being married to someone who was very good at their job. They did not say the last part out loud, but it was there, companionable and unspoken, between 2 men sitting at the edge of someone else's professional world. Then came the speeches. Diane's regional director introduced her with genuine warmth. There were accomplishments listed, a few laughs, deserved applause. Then Diane took the microphone and thanked her team with the polished ease of someone who had done this many times. She was good at it. She was genuinely, undeniably good at it. And then she said it. She had just finished describing how she'd built a team from scratch 6 years ago, making decisions that not everyone had agreed with at the time. She smiled out at the room and said with the confidence of a woman who knows she has the room, "Of course, I've always been good at committing to things that turn out to be complicated. My husband Richard can confirm that. He's been here 28 years, poor man. I suppose he was my first mistake." The room laughed. Warm laughter. Knowing laughter. The laughter of people who understood it was a joke. Richard smiled. He did it automatically, the way you do when a camera turns toward you. But something had shifted. He sat very still and felt it. Not anger, not humiliation, not quite sadness. Something quieter than all of those. Something that arrives only when a thing you have been almost knowing for a long time finally becomes completely clear. He thought about every dinner where his observations had been met with her polite half-attention. Every social event where she'd glanced at him the way a host checks on a piece of furniture that might be in the wrong position. Every joke she had made at his expense. Lightly, easily. always with the implicit assumption that he was secure enough not to mind, that his steadiness made him available for that purpose. He had always been steady, he had always not minded. Sitting in that hotel conference room, gray blazer, wine glass in hand, he realized that not minding was not the same as being okay. He drove them home in silence. She was energized, pleased with how the evening had gone. She did not ask what he thought of the speech. He did not offer it. He didn't leave immediately. That is important to say, because these things are never immediate. For 3 weeks he said less. He maintained the house, walked Bentley, had coffee with Gordon on Tuesdays. He was not cold. He was not cruel. He was simply finished in some private interior way, like a room where the fire has gone out but the walls are still warm. It was Gordon who noticed first. "You all right?" he asked one morning, not looking up from the joint he was sanding. "I think I need to change something," Richard said. Gordon nodded slowly. "Big change or small change?" Richard looked at Bentley, who had fallen asleep in a patch of weak November sun on the garage floor. "I don't know yet," he said. He told Diane in February. Not with anger, not with accusations. He sat at the kitchen table, the table he had eaten at for 19 years, the one with the small burn mark on the far corner from a candle that had gotten away from them at a Christmas dinner years ago. And he told her that he had been unhappy for a long time and that he did not think she had noticed, and that he was no longer sure she would notice even if he told her now. She was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "I didn't mean it like that. The joke." "I know," he said. "It was just the room, the mood. It was that kind of moment." "I know," he said again. "So this is about one joke?" He looked at her. "It's about what the joke showed me." She spent the weeks after that doing what she did with difficult things. She analyzed them. She talked to her sister on the phone for long evenings. She reread their history and arranged the evidence in ways that were more comfortable. She concluded that Richard had been depressed, that retirement had diminished him, that his unhappiness was internal, existential, not something she had caused, only something she had been adjacent to. There was enough truth in that version to make it believable. She held onto it carefully. She did not examine what it cost her not to ask herself the harder questions. Meanwhile, Richard found a small apartment not far from the river. He brought Bentley, his books, a few pieces of furniture. Gordon helped him move. It was a quiet afternoon. They drank tea from paper cups when it was done and stood looking out at the gray water and said almost nothing, and that was fine. They met once more, 7 months later, to sign some papers and collect the last few items he'd left behind. The house felt strange to him now, not unwelcoming, just unfamiliar in the way of places you once belonged to. He noticed she had moved the lamp in the hallway. She had changed the kitchen curtains, small things. The ordinary business of a life rearranging itself. She made tea. He accepted it. They sat at the kitchen table in the late afternoon light, and there was a particular quiet between them, not hostile, not warm. Honest, maybe. The most honest they had been in years. "You look well," she said. "I'm sleeping better," he said. She looked at her cup for a moment. Then she said, not entirely lightly, "I've been thinking about what you said, about the joke." He waited. "I think I used you," she said. Not dramatically, just flatly, the way she said things when she had arrived at a conclusion she didn't fully like. As a punchline. "Not just that night. I think I did it more than I knew." He didn't say yes, you did, because that would have been too easy. He didn't say it's all right, because it wasn't, and they were both past the age of comfortable untruths. "I think," he said slowly, "that you needed me to be the steady one, and I think I needed that role too for a long time. It kept me from having to want things." She looked at him. "What do you want?" she asked. It was a simple question, the kind of question that would have been everything 15 years ago. "Quiet," he said. "To cook. To walk Bentley in the morning. To be in a room where I don't feel like furniture." She didn't flinch from that. He respected her for it. "I'm sorry," she said. I don't know if I knew I was doing it. I don't know either, he said. I think that might be the saddest part. They finished their tea. He collected his box. Books. A photograph of the children young. A small wooden clock he'd had since before they met. She walked him to the door. At the threshold he turned and looked at her one last time. This woman he had loved genuinely and quietly for 28 years. This woman who had reduced him in small, unconscious increments until he had nearly disappeared inside the shape she'd made for him. He did not feel rage. He did not feel grief exactly. He felt something closer to tenderness. The particular tenderness you feel for someone who hurt you without ever quite intending to, because hurting you was simply easier than seeing you. He said goodbye. She said goodbye. The door closed gently. Walking to his car, he felt the autumn air on his face, cool, light, moving. Bentley was in the back seat. His new apartment was 20 minutes away. It had a window that looked east, and in the mornings the light came in at an angle that he had grown to love. There are marriages that end in storms, and there are marriages that end the way this one did, in the quiet realization, arrived at too late, that two people had spent decades being careful about all the wrong things. Not every ending is a failure. Some are simply the moment the water finally recedes, and you stand in the strange, open stillness of what remains, and you think, so that is what was always here, and you breathe, and you begin.